welcome to everybody who is joining us for session H1 today. My name is Annie Hosseth. I'm one of the IWAC directors this year. And I just want to have a quick reminder to keep your mics off during the presentation so we don't get too much feedback. And another reminder, this will be a recorded session and we'll be uploading this to the IWAC conference YouTube account to archive it. And without further ado, I'd love to hand off the reins of this presentation to Susan Miller-Cochran to introduce their panel.
All right, thank you so much, Annie. And thank you to all of you for being here today too. I know there are a lot of other fantastic sessions going on too, and Analeigh and I are really honored that you came here. I wanted to just give you a quick overview of how this is going to go. Our co-presenter, Christen, is unable to be here with us today. So we did pre-record the panel portion, the presentations. So we'll play that part for you, but then Analeigh and I are here to facilitate the Q&A afterwards. And the recording runs just under 40 minutes. We tried to keep it as short as we could to make sure we had some time for conversation. So we'll make sure that we give plenty of time for that. And since a few of you were also in the session, the really fantastic session yesterday, it was C4 that Amy Mapes and Lauren Harvey and Lindsay Hansen and Brad Jacobson did, where they described some of the work going on in writing across the curriculum at the University of Arizona. This kind of gives even more context for some of that work that's being done. So if you didn't have a chance to attend that session, it's C4. You could also take a look at their presentation, and that would give you a little bit of background information about the history of writing across the curriculum at our institution too. So I'll hand it back to you, Annie, and I'm going to turn off the sounds since Lindsay taught us how to do that at the beginning of the session yesterday, and Lindsay knows everything about technology. So I'm muting myself now.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. One moment. All right.
Hello, welcome to our IWAC presentation, Scaffolding from Foundations, Connecting Foundations Writing with General Education Writing Requirements. I am one of your hosts. My name is Analeigh Horton. I use she, her pronouns. And I am super excited to introduce my beloved colleagues from the University of Arizona, which includes Christen, who is a colleague of mine who we work together in the English department. We're both working on our PhDs, and we also have the privilege and honor of working in our general education department, or office, where we are working to refresh our entire curriculum. And that is directed by the wonderful Dr. Susan Miller-Cochran, who is also joining us today. And the three of us are super honored to be here. So thank you so much for tuning in. And I'll just give a quick little promotion for the live Q&A that we'll be doing whenever IWAC is happening in a few weeks. So we hope to see you then. Without further ado, I want to welcome you to access our slides. You can use this short URL, so feel free to either pause the video now and link out, but don't worry, we also have them listed on the bottom right-hand corner of all of our slides if you realize later that you want to come back and look at them. Then before we dive into our presentation, I just want to acknowledge that the University of Arizona sits on the indigenous homelands of the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui tribes. And we are honored to be able to be a land-grant university that sits on this land and partner with the local people in working towards an educational opportunities for the state of Arizona and beyond. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Susan.
All right, thank you so much, Analeigh, for that introduction. And I'm going to start by giving a sense of what the project's background is, the context in which we did the research and what the research design looked like. And then Julie and Analeigh are going to go into the results of that research and some of the implications about it. So you could go to the next slide, Analeigh. To provide some institutional context, we wanted to give a sense of the timeline that we were working with. And we start this timeline in 2012, which is when a 5-year longitudinal study of student writing at the University of Arizona was begun by Amy Kimihei and Amy Mapes. And they continued that work until 2017, when they stopped collecting that student writing. And one of the conclusions that they came to in that work that they did was that there was a gap that existed in the students' writing experience at the sophomore level. So they took their foundations writing classes, English 101 and 102, usually their freshman year. And then there wasn't a lot of work that was going on with writing until their junior and senior years, when they were doing more writing in their majors. So they started to identify that there was this gap that seemed to appear in the longitudinal work that or the data that they had collected. In the midst of that, the University of Arizona was also conducting writing assessments in 2014-15 in that academic year, and then again in 2018. These were pre-post assessments that were done by the provost's office. The conclusions that the provost office came to, and those assessments were assisted in the design and conducting and analyzing the data by some folks in the writing program at those times. But the conclusions that the office of the provost came to were that students weren't really improving in their writing. And of course, there's a lot that we could say about what that means. And I'm not giving you a lot of context yet about what those assessments looked like. But overall, that was the conclusion that the provost office came to. Given the work that Amy Kimihei and Amy Mapes had done and what they found in their study, I didn't find that conclusion that surprising, given that students weren't really doing a whole lot of work in their writing at the sophomore year, and there wasn't a lot of continuity that was taking place across their experiences of writing and the sites of writing at the university. And then in 2019, specifically the fall of 2019, and then really in the spring of 2020, we started working on the refresh of general education. And this was an initiative that came through our strategic planning process at the university. But part of that general education refresh included establishing a writing across the curriculum program and having a director of writing across the curriculum, which we had not had at the university to date, although we had writing across the curriculum initiatives in the past prior to my coming to the institution, but because of a range of budget cuts, a lot of that work had gone by the wayside. So let's go to the next slide, Analeigh, and we'll just take a quick look at our research questions that Analeigh and Julie and I were looking at. So we wanted to see specifically, and we were interested in that gap that Kimihei and Mapes were identifying, but really trying to understand if there are connections between foundations writing and then the writing that students do in their general education courses. And one piece of information that I should have included in that institutional context slide as well was that in the midst of that, between those two writing assessments, one of the ways that the provost's office tried to address the lack of improvement that they saw in student writing was that the vice provost implemented a writing requirement in all general education classes across the curriculum. And that began in spring of 2015. So all of the general education classes, regardless of what the discipline was, had to include writing in those classes. And there were specific requirements about what that writing would look like, but not a whole lot of support given to the faculty. There was some elective support given, and it was coordinated by wonderful staff and graduate students working in the Office of Instruction and Assessment, which is our version of a Center for Teaching and Learning. They did some wonderful workshops. Often those were the self-selected people who were interested in talking about writing who would come to those though. So there was this requirement for writing, and we were interested to see what kinds of potential connections were going on between foundations writing and the writing students were doing in gen ed. So our research questions really circled around this primary question that's in bold on this slide. What connections, if any, exist between the writing assignments and approaches to teaching writing in general education courses and foundations writing courses? So we wanted to know, what connections can we find? What possibilities are there in the writing assignments themselves, and then also the approaches that the faculty are using to teaching. And then we broke that down into 3 specific research questions. First, what is the range of how instructors in general education courses are approaching the requirement of writing in their classes? What are they doing? Second, what reasons do instructors give for approaching the writing requirement in the way that they do? And then third, focusing on foundations writing, how do the foundations writing instructors understand the relationship of their classes to the rest of the curriculum and to the university? So we really wanted to get into understanding what those connections look like. Let's go ahead to the next slide, Analeigh. So the methods that we used to respond to those questions included first, issuing a survey to all of the instructors teaching general education and foundations writing in the spring of 2020. We didn't have a high response rate to that. It was about 18%. Some of you may be aware that there were a few other things going on in the world in spring of 2020 that kind of interrupted the research that we were doing, but we did have 98 responses. And so we did feel that at least in this particular study, in a kind of pilot version, that it was enough for us to at least analyze and see what we could learn from those responses. We requested participants to complete the survey, and then they had the option of sharing an assignment prompt with us, and they could also indicate their willingness to participate in an interview or focus group. Some instructors did both of those, some did none, some did one or the other, but they had the option of doing those 2 things after completing the survey. The survey responses helped us to determine who we wanted to make sure that we invited to those interviews and focus groups. We were interested in having a range of ranks of faculty, a range of disciplines. And then the assignment prompts and the interviews and focus groups were inductively coded by the themes that we found in those responses. And Analeigh and Julie did a lot of that coding, and we'll talk about those results. So we could go to the next slide, Analeigh. I wanted to just briefly share with you a couple of the survey results that we found interesting. And of course, this isn't all that we found in the survey, but just 3 questions that we thought the results were particularly interesting. First, we found that a majority of the instructors who completed the survey said that they perceived the writing that they assigned to be connected to other things that students are doing in the curriculum. And then also a majority either agreed or somewhat agreed that they know what their students need to know about writing for future contexts. And keep in mind, this is both gen ed and foundations writing instructors. And then finally, they said that they assign writing based on what they think their students need for future writing contexts, whether it's academic writing or perhaps workplace writing after they finish their degrees. So the sense we had from the survey responses is that teachers really do feel that they know what students need to know about writing. One of the things we were interested in seeing as we looked at those assignment prompts is how that manifests in terms of what they're giving in assignments, and then also their responses in the interviews and focus groups, how they talk about that. And then let's go to the next survey, or the next slide, Analeigh. And then finally, we wanted to share with you a couple of the challenges that the faculty who responded to the survey reported in assigning writing in their classes. A lot of these classes are large enrollment classes, so many of the faculty said that they had difficulty giving students enough feedback on their writing. That is a requirement for gen ed writing in our courses. They felt that there was a lack of student preparation for doing academic writing, and faculty indicate a range of different things when you talk to them about why they think that that's the case, but they did generally think there was a lack of preparation and a lack of student motivation that they indicated as a challenge. And then finally, that they saw a lot of their students depending on high school writing strategies, and they had a lack of college level writing and research skills. So these are just a few of the challenges that we saw those faculty reporting and trying to work with writing in their classes. So we can go ahead to the next slide, Analeigh. And I'm going to turn it over to Julie, who's going to talk about the instructor interviews and focus groups.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Susan. If you want to pop over to the next slide, Analeigh. I wanted to kind of overview why we ended up doing interviews and focus groups and sort of our goals and how those aligned with our research questions. So we did end up inviting a mix of general education instructors who taught writing emphasis courses, writing program instructors, and then some instructors who taught both. Their courses were in general education or foundations writing, sometimes at the same time, and try to understand the breadth of the experiences of those instructors, because teaching writing in the writing program versus gen ed courses can vary pretty widely. We also wanted to get a good sense of what instructors mean when they say what good writing is, especially for instructors who are teaching writing specific to their individual disciplines, especially outside foundations writing. And then we wanted to compare instructors' writing related expectations for students when they enter the classroom, especially since we had that reported challenge of dependence on high school writing strategies or a lack of college level writing and research skills. We wanted to kind of understand what are college level writing and research skills and those expectations according to the instructors teaching these courses. And then we were looking for opportunities to connect writing assignments and instruction across the writing program and general education, especially to meet that sophomore year gap noted by Kimmy Hay and Mapes. Especially because a lot of students who take courses in the writing program will take 101 and 102 in their first year, oftentimes concurrently with general education courses, and then there's some kind of gap happening in that second year. And then the last goal was just to begin brainstorming some instructor support for writing instruction for the Writing Across the Curriculum initiative that's kind of being paired with the general education refresh. And you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So just a little breakdown of the participants we had for the interviews and focus groups. We ended up with 21 people who took us up on doing an interview and or focus group with us. 10 of those instructors taught just general education courses. 8 of those instructors taught in the Foundations Writing program. And then 3 instructors taught both general education courses and Foundations Writing. And you can hop over to the next slide. So we started with what's good writing? What does good writing mean to you? And I kind of organized this based on agreement and then some differences. So I'll start with general education, actually on the far right. Because of the large enrollment courses and that emphasis on, or I should say the challenges noted about giving students enough feedback, conciseness was really important to those instructors, especially in terms of giving 200 plus students feedback on their writing. It helped if the writing was concise and shorter. And then on the end with foundations writing, a lot of emphasis was placed on rhetorical elements of writing. So thinking about a specific audience, having a clear purpose, providing plenty of context, and then focusing on things like delivery and other elements. And then agreement between the instructors and including some of the instructors who taught both is that writing should have a clear purpose, it should be concise, communicates to that intended audience, and again, more emphasis on clear communication, which I think sort of is a nod towards students understand who their audience is and what they're trying to communicate to that group. And my dog is scratching me, so that's where we're at. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks. So some of the expectations that we heard from instructors, both in general education and foundations writing when it came to their students, had to do with kind of a spectrum. Most instructors, when we said, what expectations do you have for your students coming into your classroom, is that they said they didn't have expectations. Another way we asked that question is, what kinds of things surprise you when you have students come into your class that you realize you have to kind of stop and backtrack or maybe focus a little bit more on certain areas. But both gen ed instructors and foundations writing instructors really tried to be flexible to student needs, especially in the first year because of the diverse preparation students have coming into these classes. But gen ed instructors did note that beyond the first year, they thought students should have some knowledge of organization, as in with paragraph structuring or sentence structuring, grammar and citation practices, which I think indicates we're leaning a little bit on foundations writing and hoping they're getting those things out of English 101, 102. And again, they noted their own sort of frustration with how capable they were of providing lots of individual support and feedback for students in large enrollment courses. For foundations writing instructors, their goals were overall to provide a foundation of writing, language thinking, and research skills. If you go to the next slide, I have some of the expectations for instructors who taught both. And this group, we tried to talk to them about making connections between what they taught in foundations writing and what they see as being taught in general education courses, especially courses that focus on writing. And they tended to struggle just because there aren't a lot of really specific, clear connections between what's happening in foundations writing, and gen ed courses can't really depend on what's happening in foundations writing, especially if gen ed course, if students are taking those courses concurrently. So if you have a freshman student in a gen ed course who's also taking foundations writing, you can't depend on them to know all of the research skills or academic writing skills that they might take up in their first year, because they're right in the middle of that process. And this set of instructors did expect students to be able to do research and organize their writing, but when asked how they meet students where they are, if they are deemed to be behind on things like research practices or organization, they tended to refer students to outside sources. So things like Purdue OWL or library resources, often library resources from other institutions. So that was kind of an interesting finding we had. And if you want to go to the next slide. The last thing we kind of focused on with the interviews and focus groups was overall experiences with teaching writing. And this kind of fell into, I think, 3-ish categories. So the first is that they all thought teaching writing was really important. We didn't have any instructors who thought or who didn't understand why they were teaching writing in general education. But they did express some frustration at the culture or lack of culture of writing on campus, just because there's a lot of dissonance between instructors. Even in foundations writing, some instructors mentioned if they taught a 101 course and then taught 102, they couldn't necessarily depend on students having a standardized experience in 101. And so kind of having to be flexible to that. And then that sort of just expanded out for the gen ed courses, that every student had a different experience with foundations writing, so they can't really lean on really specific projects or necessarily like research practices. And then the third is just challenges with connecting writing experiences between foundations writing and gen ed, and a lack of support systems or clear connection points. As I mentioned, with the variation in student preparation or even student engagement, students who took foundations writing but maybe didn't participate at the level that we would hope would obviously have a different experience than trying to participate in writing at the gen ed or in their gen ed courses. And then students themselves seem to struggle with making connections between what they do in foundations writing and what they do later in their programs. And you can go to the next slide, where I'll hand it over to Analeigh to talk about our writing assignment prompts.
Thank you. I'm back. Hello again. So I'm super excited to talk about our writing prompts, mostly because they were so diverse, and it was a super fascinating insight into what kinds of writing our students are being asked to do. So just to give you a brief overview of our assignment prompts, which you'll see I've abbreviated to APs here. We received 47 assignment prompts from our 98 participants. And of those, we were able to analyze 37 of them. So we had 21 different departments, and then 24 assignments came from general education and 13 came from foundations writing. So these definitions that you see here are definitions that we wrote based on the codes that we created when we were looking at the different assignment prompts. So you can read through those at your leisure, but you'll see that the majority of the assignments that were being given were either what we termed analysis papers or expository papers. And you'll hear me use the word papers. That is a word that comes from the data. Papers or essay is a common word that we saw throughout all of these assignment prompts. I also want to take a minute to briefly reflect on assessment. So this was kind of a side project that we looked at, was how was this writing being assessed? And you'll notice that a little over half of the assignment prompts did mention some sort of assessment, and the majority of those used a standard rubric. So you think of like the blocks on the page, right? But there were a couple of holistic or self-evaluations that were used. We tended to see these non-standard assessment methods in the writing classes as opposed to the general education classes. But you'll also see that a little under half didn't mention assessment at all. A hypothesis for this is that perhaps the assessment information was provided in the syllabus. But I'll just throw out a joke that I've been seeing thrown around the internet about if professors actually had the ability to brainwash their students, wouldn't we get them to read the syllabus, right? And I kind of can apply that here. If theoretically the assessment information is on the syllabus, which we don't know, we didn't collect syllabi in this study, but what is the likelihood of students going to look at that syllabus? You know, are they only checking it on that first day of class? Are they meaningfully making connections between the requirements on the assignment prompt and the ways that the instructors are going to be grading? And kind of to hearken to what Julie was saying about large enrollments, a lot of these courses are being taught with teaching assistants, and so or grading assistants, and so a lot of the students would have different graders, right, if they were in a large enrollment class. So these were just some things to think about kind of going on in the background or the second half of the writing process, if you will. But I want to take a moment to do what a lot of writing teachers tell their students to do, which is show and not necessarily tell. So I'm going to come out of the slides just for a second and show you 3 different assignment prompts. So you'll see that the first one comes from the Religious Studies and Classics department. And I put the title of this assignment prompt in quotes because that's a direct quote. That's what the assignment referred to itself as. So for this first one, it's going to be a research proposal. The second one we'll look at is a writing assignment from the Family and Community Medicine department. And then finally, we will look at paper 3 from the College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture. So, okay. You should be able to see a PDF here. Okay, great. Thank you to my colleagues. So this is the one, as you can probably guess from the ancient athletics title, that this is from the classics department. And so this is going to be probably the most in-depth assignment prompt that you would see in our entire data set. It is 4 pages long and has a lot of information. So again, I'll just remind you that you can click out into our slides, and then you should be able to access these if you want to look at them in more depth. But just as kind of a highlight reel, you'll see that this project or assignment prompt gives a lot of background information. It's giving a lot of specifics about, word count and formatting guidelines. It's giving additional content information from Cicero's Canons of Rhetoric, and then just continued information about the project and how students should be going through the process. Additionally, we see different resources. So at the University of Arizona, we have the Writing Skills Improvement Program, and then our Writing Center is housed in a unit called the Think Tank. And so you see both of those listed over here as places for students to go. We see the learning objectives clearly enumerated, and then it gives different topics that students might be interested in and a list of Q&As. So like I said, this is probably the most in-depth assignment prompt that we received, and you can look at that in comparison to this assignment prompt. I'm not going to throw any shade on this or anything. I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but you can probably just visually notice that this assignment prompt has considerably less detail. It still links out to different resources that students could use, but like Julie mentioned earlier, some of these resources are not specific to the University of Arizona, or they don't give in-depth directions on how to use them. This is an example, excuse me, of an assignment prompt that mentions some sort of grading method, but does not give the assessment information. They did not give the information to us, and just gives a really quick blurb about the text that they're looking for. Finally, I'm going to show you this activity 4, and I would say this is probably a middle of the road assignment prompt. So I showed you the 2 different ends of the spectrum first, and now I'll show you the most common type of assignment prompt, at least in terms of looks and the kind of content that is included. So this gives a little bit more contextual information as to where this assignment is coming in the course sequence and relates it to other coursework that students have been doing. This is kind of a proposal researchy kind of activity that students are going to build on. It gives some information about how students can find different resources, right? And then, like I said, connects out to this third paper assignment. So you can see again, the word paper is something that's used as opposed to giving a more clear definition of genre. And that was why when we were creating codes, we had to create the definitions because they weren't as prolific as they possibly could have been in some of these assignment prompts. So I'm going to go back over to our slides. Okay. And let this load. Awesome. Okay, so just a couple of takeaways that I want to mention from the assignment prompts is that clearly there are a lot of disciplinary genres and writing situations. The University of Arizona is a very large school with a pretty diverse student population and lots of different majors that students have and interests that they hold. So there's a lot of different things that students are going to interact with. Including the multiplicity of ways that they're receiving different assignment prompts. Lots of different information included or rather excluded. Sometimes you get a lot of great guidance and sometimes you don't. And one thing that I'll mention that Susan said at the beginning is that all of our participants were self-selecting. So theoretically, these participants and their assignment prompts are coming from folks that are really interested in the teaching of writing, right? So that's just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind when we're thinking about information that is or is not included in some of these assignment prompts. One thing that we might look forward to in the future is student usability testing, right? Julie and I are students, right? But we're also instructors. We're kind of more on the faculty side of things as compared to being undergraduate students. So that's our analytical positionality, if you will. So including real users of these assignment prompts to give feedback might be a great place to kind of take the next step. But all of this information about the assignment prompts and then also the just contextual information that the instructors provided in the interviews and focus groups gave us the question of how can we make writing an enjoyable, meaningful experience? Susan mentioned that we had a writing requirement, and something that I've noticed in my continued work with instructors over the past year is that for a lot of instructors, they had the writing requirement because it was a requirement, right? It wasn't something fun or inspiring or meaningful for them, and that's very easily translated to students. So how can we make this something that people actually want to do and are participating in willingly and joyfully, as opposed to just trudging their heels through the process, which leads us to the implications section. So primarily, we really want to make these connections between the sites of writing really clear and really meaningful. So not just within individual units of just being within the Foundations Writing program, but connecting Foundations Writing to other disciplinary sites, but then making connections within those. So if we're thinking about Foundations Writing from the first semester to the second semester of the sequence, or from one major course to a minor course, from a general education course to a major course, how can we make all of these connections more obvious, for our students across the curriculum, across their entire general education and academic experience writ large at UA. We recognize that students are doing a lot of writing to learn and processing all of the new disciplinary information that they are developing. And so again, I just want to reiterate that we really want writing to be a meaningful tool that students can use to develop that content knowledge, but also develop as a writer, thinking about those rhetorical elements that Julie had mentioned from the focus groups. All right, so I'm going to pass it off for somebody else to talk about the next implication. I think it's Susan.
It is me. So I want to underscore that one of the reasons that we had conducted this research, a lot of that was internally focused. We wanted to understand how can we do a better job of teaching writing across the curriculum at U of A, and how can we structure a writing across the curriculum program to really be advantageous to to the students at our university, but we do also hope that there are some implications that we're talking about that are useful to other institutions as well. And what resulted from this research immediately was that we wrote a white paper that we gave to the new director of writing across the curriculum, Amy Mapes, and also to the provost and other administrators who are stakeholders at the university, and our senior director of writing at U of A, Shelley Rodrigo. And one of the things that we talked about in quite a bit of detail in our recommendations section in that white paper was that we needed to rethink and perhaps redesign the infrastructure for supporting reflective learning and engagement to support writing across the curriculum. And so some of those things that, that we did are within the realm of the Gen Ed redesign. So first of all, Amy Mapes was the person who, as the director of writing across the curriculum, really led the effort to redesign our Gen Ed writing attribute. She worked with a group of other experts in writing and then also some faculty from across the curriculum who had experience teaching writing in their Gen Ed classes to really rethink what that Gen Ed writing attribute would look like. And then how that pairs with the written communication assessment that we're required to do for our Board of Regents in the state of Arizona. So we wanted to make sure that we have really good alignment between what our outcomes are for written communication, what our faculty are doing in the classroom, which a lot of that is governed by how we design that writing attribute, and then how that's being assessed so that all of those are aligned. And then we also have introduced signature assignments in general education. So all of the courses in our general education program are required to have at least one signature assignment. Some have more than one, depending on how faculty have decided they want to focus on the outcomes of the course. So our signature assignments, they don't all have to be in writing, and there are a lot of other modalities or different kinds of assignments students might complete that are signature assignments, but those assignments are opportunities for students to really demonstrate how they've mastered the outcomes in the course. And as they're completing those signature assignments and uploading them into an e-portfolio, which is part of what we have introduced in our new Gen Ed program, they're collecting artifacts from across the curriculum and they're reflecting on those artifacts, but we also are introducing that in the structure of our Gen Ed program. We have two bookend courses at the beginning of Gen Ed and at the end, where they start that portfolio and then where they finalize it. So they're looking at those signature assignments and reflecting on and thinking about what they've learned about writing and what they've learned about the other outcomes in Gen Ed across the curriculum. So again, that helps to maintain that constructive alignment at the course level, but also for us at the program level, so that as we articulate what our learning outcomes are for general education, then we can also point to the courses that students are doing or taking and the activities that they're doing as being aligned with those outcomes. And then how we assess that will be looking at those different artifacts that they've collected and at their reflections as they've been completing that work across the curriculum. So that helps us to develop a much better infrastructure for supporting reflective learning and engagement, and hopefully for really supporting students as they continue to develop as writers. So I'll hand it to Julie for the next one.
Thanks, Susan. Last but not least, related to students having a better connected experience between foundations writing, general education, or between courses in general education that might approach writing in different ways, we thought about opportunities for connections in terms of the community of writers and also the community of instructors of writing. And the first thing that came to mind was more networking opportunities for instructors who teach writing in Gen Ed or in foundations writing or in other courses. And one way that we have approached that with the general education refresh is with what we're calling the general education quick start, which is a live online based or module based training is too strong of a word, but sort of an overview of the general education refresh to get faculty who are transitioning their courses from existing gen ed courses to new gen ed courses, or from non-gen ed courses to new gen ed courses down the line, to better understand how is the curriculum changing, what are the different attributes that they could be taking into consideration. With this particular presentation, the writing attribute is sort of at the forefront, and getting instructors to think through how they're getting students to engage with writing in meaningful ways, doing more writing to learn activities, doing more reflective work in their classes, and kind of getting to bounce ideas off of each other. The live online portions of the Quick Start are all kind of workshop based, where instructors bring their ideas and share out on what they're doing with their course, and then get feedback and hopefully generate new, interesting, innovative approaches. The second opportunity we thought through was making sure that different writing resources on campus, like the Writing Center and Think Tank, communicate with each other, so that there's sort of an understanding that if a student has one experience in the Writing Center, they might have similar experiences in other spaces. And then the last one, which we're kind of still thinking through, is to develop a sustained culture of mentoring. I think some of the mentoring is happening in the Quick Starts, or I didn't mention FLCs. FLC is Faculty Learning Community, is that correct? On campus, and trying to get a sense of like, is there mentoring happening between instructors and also mentoring between students? So something like near peer mentoring, or having preceptors where former students are able to provide some guidance or feedback, or at least share their experiences with completing the general education program, or working through different courses with writing emphasis. That's something that we're sort of considering as we move through the refresh. I think we can go to the last slide, which is just to thank you all so much for hanging out with us for the last however long we've been talking. We have our email addresses here if you want to reach out with any questions or specific comments or what have you. We do have a link there about the Gen Ed refresh. And then again, these slides are available through that bit.ly link at the bottom, and you should be able to access those assignment prompts that, that Analeigh demonstrated. So thank you all so much.
All right, thanks again, everybody, for being here. And we wanted to open up the session for some Q&A. And Analeigh and I are both here, and we're happy to provide more context if that's helpful. And I just wanted to reiterate again, there's a lot more context about the history of writing across the curriculum at our institution too in session C4, which maybe my favorite thing of having conferences online is you can go back and like watch other sessions you couldn't attend. It's really awesome. So, but I'll give that little plug too. So I'll do my best to kind of watch, and you could either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like, or put it in the chat. We'll watch that too. And yeah, Daniel.
I had to make sure I had my order of operations of lowering my hand and then unmuting. There's a lot of anxiety involved in that process that doesn't.
Yeah, you did awesome. And I always
Thank
forget
you.
one of those. Usually I leave my hand up and I'm still muted when I start talking.
Yeah. I'm wondering a little bit about the sense from the provost's office that students were not improving as writers, and how that relates to the fact that the student population changed over time, right?
Yeah. There's so much I could say about this. And I think I saw it. Yeah, Amy's in here too. And I bet she would have a lot she could say about this as well. So I will say that our vice provost for academic affairs is the one who had kind of spearheaded those writing assessments. And she has been really interested in trying to find ways to improve student writing. She's a biologist. Writing studies isn't her area. What I have really appreciated about her is she's very open to listening to and talking with those of us in writing studies. I've always found her to be interested in having conversations. With that said, she has really strong opinions about what she thinks good writing is, but not, and she's been open to hearing different ideas about how you might help students improve. The reason I said in our presentation that I wasn't too surprised at the outcome, part of it was the design of the assessment that they did. And then the other was the outcome of the research that Amy Mates and Kimmy Hay, the Amy's, had done, doing that longitudinal study of student writing at U of A. But the design of the assessment, they did a pre-post, but they were taking samples from students at the same time. So it wasn't the same students pre-post. So they were taking a sample, I know, so they took a sample from freshmen and they were taking those from Foundations writing classes. And then they took samples from gen ed classes in their senior year. And one of the immediate problems I saw, and I'm just gonna say, you know, in the interest of self-disclosure, as a person who did take a gen ed class as a senior, it was because I had put it off and it was a class I didn't want to take. And so I took it at the very end and I was kind of blowing it off. So I had some concerns about, you know, how invested really are students in that writing that they're doing. And when you pair that with the gap in student writing at the sophomore level that Napes and Kimmy Hay had found in their work, it just sort of spelled all kinds of problems. They were also using, to assess the writing, they were using a somewhat modified version of the value rubric. So they did this assessment twice. The first time those were scored on campus using the value rubric. The second time we actually participated in the Value Institute. And to the Vice Provost's credit, I think it was the same summer that we sent all of those essays in to have them scored as part of the Institute. She and I and our Assistant Director of Assessment and our Assistant Director in the Writing Program for Placement, the four of us did the training for the Value Institute. And I had said to her, if we're gonna use this, I think it would be good if we go through the training so we know exactly what they're doing. So we did it. And I remember on the last day, I don't know if any of you have done the Value Institute training and scoring, but you have a certain amount of time to finish it. And so that last day before we were supposed to have all of our scores in, I got a text really late at night from the Vice Provost asking if I would give her a call because there were some things on the rubric. She said, this just doesn't even make sense. Like, and what she was noticing was what both Amy and I have said for years, that if, and this comes right out of research from people like Chris Anson, that if you take one rubric and you try to apply it to a dozen different genres, you're gonna have problems. And so she was starting to see that, okay, this is a bit of an issue. And I've heard her a couple of times in meetings where we're talking about the value rubric, she'll sort of say offhand, like, well, and I know how Susan feels about the value rubric. I'm like, well, I mean, it's not that I think it's evil. And there were wonderful people in our field who worked on it. It's just that it has been used in the Institute in a way that it was not intended when it was first written. And recently, for some work that Analeigh and I were doing, I reached out to Linda Adler-Kastner and Kathy Yancey just to ask, when you were working on this, was the intention actually that people would modify the rubric for their institutional context? And they said, absolutely. That kind of in the way that we talk about the WPA outcome statement, but it hasn't been. So that was those were the assessments that had been done. The assessment project that I mentioned that we now are required to do for our Board of Regents, and I kind of slid that in the presentation without going into a lot of detail. That has taken up, I know, a lot of Amy's time. But the Board of Regents has required that the 3 state institutions, so this is Arizona State, University of Arizona, Northern Arizona, that we work together to develop assessments that we would use on all 3 campuses for 4 different curricular areas. One of them is written communication. So that's led to some really interesting conversations about, okay, what should these assessments look like? Is there a way that we can design this in a way that is flexible enough to be relevant to each of those campuses and also relevant to the many different kinds of majors that we have on those campuses and the different kinds of writing? And on our campus, that's led to our developing an e-portfolio project that is part of what we're doing in gen ed. So the signature assignments that students are doing all are uploaded into an e-portfolio. And then the samples can be taken from those e-portfolios to be used in the assessment. And Amy's the one who's leading the design of the assessment on our campus, not an administrator who's not in writing studies. So we're trying to make sure that for each of those 4 curricular areas, we have people who really have expertise in those areas, designing and leading those assessments. That's probably a lot more than you asked for, Dan, but did I answer your question?
That was exactly as much as I wanted.
Okay.
Congratulations on blooming a beautiful tree out of a pretty thin soil.
You're way too kind, but I'll take it. All right. I haven't been looking at the chat, but I don't think I see, I don't see other questions in there. Other questions either about, since we have Amy here, so we could talk about WAC writ large at U of A. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you work when you were just coming to listen to a session, Amy. But she gave such a great history of WAC yesterday in her session too. But we could also talk about the research design too, or the study and the implications.
I guess one thing that I can add as people think of other questions they might have that kind of speaks to what Susan was saying, if there's just so many different ideas across campus. I mentioned this briefly in the presentation itself, but as we were trying to do the qualitative coding for this project, holy cow, get yourself a big bottle of Excedrin because it was really challenging. There were all kinds of different words that were used and none of them meant the same thing. And I joked like everything was called paper or essay, right? But that's, I mean, some people might argue that, you know, 5-paragraph essay is not a genre or that a paper is not a genre, right? I'm not going to go down that contention, but all that to say, it can be really challenging to work, you know, even within our writing studies, right? Threshold concepts, we're trying to agree on different things, right? And then we, as you branch farther and farther out, and Susan said, we have to cooperate with our friends across the state, right? And so there's a lot of different opinions and voices and trying to make this a collaborative, shared process, right? And make sure that the students can like use this and engage, you know, meaningfully in this work, right? Has been really challenging to plan and then also to implement. So I just wanted to really highlight that as a struggle that we have experienced.
Yeah, and Sandra and Mandy, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's exactly the challenge. I mean, no wonder we were not surprised that our students didn't seem to be transferring or repurposing what they were learning in foundations writing into other contexts because there was no consistency. And one thing that I know Amy has really made clear in conversations that we've been having about writing across the curriculum is we need to have common language that we're using. Sometimes that leads to great debate about whose language reigns supreme. I'm thinking specifically, Amy, of a debate that we had with the vice provost about the use of the word genre, which she's not a fan of, but at least we're having those conversations. And to be honest, you know, I've been at U of A only for 6 years, but I'm so excited about the direction that I see things heading because we're having these conversations. Having people engaged in conversation about it is, to me, what's most important. Also, the other 3 areas that we have to assess with the universities, one is quantitative reasoning, also critical thinking, and then the 4th is civic knowledge and American institutions, which we're still figuring out how to interpret what. Well, actually, all of those are challenging to interpret, but we've gotten the most headway on written communication and quantitative reasoning because those are more typical assessment areas.
And to speak to the value of a conference like this, we really early on realized, especially as I've worked between written communication and then quantitative reasoning, writing studies is much more of an established field. It's something people specialize in, right? You might have interests in some of these other things that Susan has mentioned, but we as writing scholars have really benefited from the community, right? So we're glad to be able to collaborate with y'all here today and continue to learn. It's proved to be very valuable in our implementation efforts.
I'll throw a question out to you all, if that's all right, because U of A, I mean, clearly we're finally entering the 1980s by establishing an official WAC program, right? So we're a little behind the curve. But one of the things that I keep thinking about because of the position I'm in directing Gen Ed, which right now is providing not all, but much of the funding for writing across the curriculum. I want to think really carefully about how to set that structure up so that long-term it's sustainable and it won't matter whether it's me and Amy, like if someone else rotates in and is the director of general education, that we still have a strong foundation and a strong budget for that. But I know a lot of times when we're starting initiatives like writing across the curriculum, we're looking for the opportunities that might provide resources. And I'm wondering from those of you who have a lot more experience with this, what tips or recommendations or ideas do you have for how to make something like that sustainable when you're working with initial funding from something like a strategic plan? No ideas. Yeah, Sandra.
There's way too many decisions one has to make with the raising hand things. I guess I think you're actually lucky coming to this late because you can learn from the stupid mistakes that the rest of us made. So that's a good thing. I'm thinking about, I'm making notes to myself about everything I want to do, and I'm looking at this assessment that you did. And one thing I would say as a word of warning, we got kind of sucked into Gen Ed, and I'm really pleased we did, in 2008. Now, small schools are different than big schools, and so once you get into something, it's easy to get smothered. We lost the right to assess our own program. Gen Ed now assesses writing rather than the writing across the, I'm director of writing across the curriculum. I have no assessment responsibilities. And so they set out to try to assess it without including me because they assess Gen Ed one thing every year and had no idea how to do it. So one thing I would say is when you're not the director of Gen Ed anymore and there's a different one, within whatever kind of structure you have, writing people need to be able to assess writing because I think we know what questions to ask. So I don't know. I don't know whether our situation is entirely unusual or just something that happens at small schools sometimes, but that's my word of advice, I guess. Because I love the surveys that you did and the way that you studied this and the way that you could say, wait, this is a problem. And not all of us can do that anymore because of Gen Ed. Although if anyone has a suggestion about how I can fix that, please do let me know.
That's such great advice, Sandra. And the research that we did, and also, and there's another research study that Amy and Lauren Harvey and Brad Jacobson and Lindsay had presented on yesterday. So a lot of this research, we started by all working together to design what we wanted to do. And we were doing that proactively. Nobody was asking us to do this assessment. And I was taking to heart Ed White's mantra of assess thyself or assessment will be done unto thee. So I was like, well, if we kind of get out ahead of the curve, maybe we can shape the narrative about what people are paying attention to, because what was happening is that the provost's office was doing the assessment with some consultation with us, but we weren't in charge of it. And so then they were also doing the interpretation of the data, which I found even more problematic, and kind of telling us what it meant. So that's, I think, really wise counsel. And then Daniel mentioned in the chat, connecting to programmatic assessments and accreditation and university accreditation. Absolutely. Those can be good opportunities. What thoughts do you have on that, if any, that you want to share?
I'm a bigger fan of the former than the latter. So I'll put that out there, because at Minnesota we work with programs, departments, and colleges, and looking at their processes of internal assessment and looking at benchmark standards. So benchmark standards in nursing and benchmark standards in dental hygiene, et cetera. We can always make the pitch that some of these assessments are about how students write and communicate, but most of the rest of the items that are being assessed can be seen or witnessed or evidenced by forms of written communication. So we constantly try to say, there's 7 criteria here and one of them is writing, but really writing is important to anything that's related to, critical thinking, anything that's related to quantitative and statistical reasoning. We really try to insinuate ourselves into those conversations as often as we can. The double-edged sword with the university accreditation, the really top level thing, is that if you have a very positive accreditation, folks can say, oh, we've got it settled. We don't have to think about this for another 3 years. But finding ways to be useful to departments that are engaged, or programs or colleges that are engaged in their own processes of assessment, like, oh, we've got this pile of data and this could be really interesting evidence for you to bring forward, or we've got this practice of direct assessment that we're pulling from. Folks are nuts about that. When we get together for big assessment and conversations on campus, one of the things that we look for, one of the things that Pamela, my colleagues, and I are looking for, is listening for those moments where folks are talking about the ways in which they use writing assessments for all of their various assessment practices. So student engagement, DEI, whatever it happens to be. So we try to insinuate ourselves, not in a super creepy way, but all over the place.
I think that's great advice to end on, because that's a wonderful way to build productive partnerships across campus, I think, that helps sustain a program going forward. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. We really appreciate your attendance, your thoughtful comments. Enjoy the rest of the conference.